Hi guys, I am so sorry that we are not going to be able to meet live on Zoom today. I had something come up. I'm going to leave the details sparse here, but I'm having an issue with my incision and I need to get back in to see my surgeon, and unfortunately, he is only available around 11:45, so right smack dab in the middle of our classes. But do not worry, I'm going to do this really quick on this video. We're going to talk about stories because you guys are coming up on your radio stories. You're actually going to pitch them by Tuesday. And on Tuesday, we're going to have an editorial meeting on Zoom. And you guys are going to pitch your stories. You'll get feedback from me. You can get feedback from your peers. But what you're really thinking about is what you can do as a short radio piece. On our Canvas page, you'll see that I have linked to an example of a really good radio package a student did for me a couple of semesters ago about the Monroe Park reopening. That'll give you a really good sense of what exactly it is you're going to be pitching and working on. But today we're talking about what sorts of stories you're going to be working on for your first original reporting piece in this class. And as a reminder, you'll do one radio story, and then later on we'll do two TV packages. We're going to start with radio, obviously a little bit easier because it doesn't have the video component. And as far as I know, in 367, you have gotten into Audition at this point, so you'll be able to edit your radio pieces by the time that they are due. First and foremost, since we were supposed to be meeting live, you do have a daily lead exercise. So what I want you to do is read this and create a lead, just a lead, one sentence, as if you were writing a short VO for a morning newscast or a reader if you didn't have any video. So just the first sentence, just the lead. It should be short. Remember, you're thinking, what's new? What's now? How do I make this really current? Active voice, clear, conversational, concise writing. You will find the daily lead link if you go to our home page of our Canvas site and click on the daily lead exercise. I think it's number 2. And it'll have a text box where you can write your lead. Don't forget to push submit. This counts as 10 points and as your attendance for the day. So please do it. It's going to disappear at 3 o'clock today. So do it now. Okay, after writing what I assume was the best lead you've ever written, let's talk about what is news. So we could go really big with this, right? Like zoom way out and go bird's eye view and talk about what is the media? What's the point of the media? What is news? But I want to be really practical today and instead of thinking about what is news in a general sense, I want to think about what is news in the sense of you as a local news reporter and even you as a student reporter. In these situations, it's easy to say that, a missing person, the FDA releasing new guidance for booster shots, an election. Those are all very obvious newsworthy things. But in terms of, what's news for you? What should you be covering for your radio package? How do you recognize news at a local level? That's what we're going to focus on today. In general, when we talk about news values, and this is something you develop over time, and of course, not all journalists agree on which stories are news, but you hear these values thrown out a lot. Timeliness, that's kind of an obvious one. Is it happening now? That makes it more newsworthy. Impact, how many people are impacted? Does it, seriously impact one person? Novelty, things that are new and interesting tend to be newsworthy. Conflict is a big one, much to our detriment sometimes, but conflict is an actual news value. Proximity, we tend to care about things that are happening closer to home. Prominence, when famous people do things, it becomes news, whereas if a regular person did it, it wouldn't be. And then, of course, this sort of vague human interest concept, that's sort of like a people will think this is interesting. I think it might be helpful for you to think of news as falling into 2 categories. First, there's responsive news, and this is what I would describe most news that local, especially local TV journalists are doing. So we're talking about responding to things that come across the assignment desk in a TV station, for example. There is an assignment desk editor who literally sits at a desk and monitors press releases, police reports, even the police scanner. They're monitoring all of these things that are coming into the newsroom. There's basically a lot of people out there who are saying, hey, this is news, this is news. And an assignment desk, that's their job, is to say, no, that isn't news, that is news. Oh, it's a slow news day, so we can actually go to that. No, there's a fire, we gotta, drop that story and go on to this next one. but it's responsive, right? These are all ideas and events that are coming into a newsroom, and all journalists are doing in this case is giving it coverage. Now, there's still a decision to be made, right? Should you cover it or not? But in general, you're being responsive to things that are already happening. The other type of news is enterprise news. This is news that we're going out and finding, not necessarily news we're creating. In some cases, we are, but things that are already happening, but we're making it news, whereas otherwise it might have just never been known or wouldn't have been a thing at all. That's called enterprise reporting. You're going to tend to do a little bit more responsive reporting in your time in school versus enterprise reporting, but enterprise reporting is really where journalism shines, right? Part of our role as journalists is to sort of be like a kind of an announcement service, right? We're just taking messages that other people have, sorting through them, putting them in context, and then redistributing them. But enterprise reporting is different, right? This is where we're actually going in, we're digging into data, we're digging into, we're doing investigative reporting. It doesn't have to be investigative per se, but that's an example of enterprise reporting. Here are a few examples. This is a headline I pulled from a few days ago. RPS School Board discusses lunch service concerns attendance policy. This is an example of responsive reporting. A reporter was keeping track of the school board meeting dates. There's always reporters at school board meetings. So it's responsive in the sense that they knew this event was happening, they knew there was going to be some news generated, and they went to it. And it's fine to go to events like that, meetings for the city, for the school, for VCU, what have you. There's often newsworthy things happening at meetings, but it's still responsive reporting. That's totally fine. You know, the reporters still had to do a lot of legwork here, right? They had to, first of all, stay up till like midnight because the school board meeting went on forever. But they also had to figure out what goes in the headline, right? There were tons of things that the school board talks about, and our school board is particularly dicey and interesting. So they still had to do some reporting, but this whole story was based off of a meeting. White children are vaccinated at rate 2 to 3 times higher, I'm not sure about that, than black children in Richmond, data shows. So you might think this is enterprise reporting, right? You might think, oh, a reporter dug into vaccination rates and sorted it by race. That, unfortunately, is not the case. This story actually generated from a press release from the health department, I believe. So you'll get that a lot, right? Even like government entities, nonprofits, data-driven entities, they'll often send out reports and they want you to report on it. Hopefully, the reporter in this case went back in, dug into the data themselves, and actually fact-checked this. I doubt they did, but hopefully they did, because that's what you should do. Because obviously there are entities that will try and spin a narrative a certain way. I don't think the health department was up to anything bad here, but it did turn into a story, but it was kind of fed to them, right? This is still responsive reporting. They didn't actually look into this data themselves. Compare that with this story from my former colleague, Jeff South. He was a professor here for about 30 years, and he's fantastic with data, and he dug into this for the Virginia Mercury. The bedrock of wealth inequality data shows big racial disparities in mortgage loans and home ownership. So Jeff loves data, dug into it, and found out that there were racial disparities in terms of which mortgages were awarded to and the race of the recipients. So that's enterprise reporting versus the other one that was data that was fed to the reporter from the health department. Obviously, you want to think about your source, and Jeff's really good at looking at data, so he was able to pull this story out. And it became a story, right? This wasn't a story before, and Jeff South made it one. That's a great example of enterprise reporting by using data. Here's another fun example of enterprise reporting. I saw this on my Facebook feed the other day. With the return of tailgating at Michigan State University, a lucrative side gig is back, collecting discarded cans for money. One canner says he makes up to $150 each game day. So it's an interesting twist on kind of a return to football story. Instead of just reporting on the fact that football was back and tailgating was back with it, this reporter found this person collecting cans. And I like to think that the reporter just noticed this person collecting cans and asked them their story, and then the whole thing sort of unraveled. So that's a great example of just seeing something and following up on it, and hey, it turns into an NPR story. So where do responsive news stories come from? If you work in an assignment desk, they come to you from the sky in your inbox. People slipping you press releases all the live long day. But you are not an assignment desk, right? You aren't going to have things fed to you as easily as a newsroom. But you can still go out there and look, right? There are lots of events and meetings that are posted online. You might think about upcoming deadlines, upcoming events, upcoming meetings. So sometimes you don't have to report on the meeting or the event itself, but maybe the lead up to the event. For an example, like when the marathon happens every year, there's a ton of preparation that goes into that. Your story can actually be about the prep. If there's a new data or a new report released, like the census data, we report on census stories for weeks because that data is so rich. Press releases, even if you don't get them in your inbox, you can still find them online. The city has press releases. You can look into those. VCU has press releases. You can look at those. Court cases, probably not so much for you guys, and probably not so much police reports either, but that's where they do come from in a newsroom. What about enterprise stories? Where do they come from? Something easy to do is following up on, if a politician mentions something in a speech, follow up on it. If there's something interesting in a report, follow up on that. So many times we just report that the new data is out, the new report is out, the speech was made, but we don't actually follow up on any of the issues or the data that's mentioned. Following up on an old story is a fun way to do an enterprise story. Go back in time and look what we were covering a year ago or 2 years ago, and then do an update. So many times we just never really have the time or the bandwidth to follow up on stuff. You can dig into public data like census data, or you can FOIA something that's public records requests. You guys probably won't be doing that this semester, but it's a great way to get stories. You can notice something small that the big outlets are not covering. This is often like neighborhood news. That's not big enough for NBC 12 to tackle, but it might be something really great for a student radio or TV story. There's also the idea of localizing a national story. I don't love stories like this because I think they're quite hard to do well, but there are definitely times where, for example, when something like immigration is big in the news, it's always nice to take a look at what local groups are doing on campus. I saw a great story the other day about there was a soccer team that was collecting jerseys and shoes and stuff for Afghan refugees. So it was an interesting way of taking a big national story and localizing it, but it was still something very specific. Here are some examples of stories that my former students have done and where they got the idea from. So you'll notice that the city had installed new signs that were reminding drivers to stop for pedestrians. They're in the middle of the street in Carytown and other busy places. A student simply noticed the new signs when they were going up and did a great story on it. It's a good radio story because you can get the sound of cars and stuff. There was a notice that went out in the Telegram once that VCU PD was warning people about bike thefts. They were up on campus and that they were offering free locks for people. That was something that was easily mined from the Telegram. The Telegram doesn't have a ton of newsworthy stuff, but every once in a while something good will come across. I had a student do a really cool story on sculpture majors who were adjusting to a semester online, because obviously that's a very difficult course to take online. That was an enterprise story. They just kind of thought of, hey, what would be really hard to teach online, and they tracked it down. Then there was this obvious story. VCU enacted a smoking ban. Oh gosh, was it last year? But it was big news. The university announced it, but the student did a great story on how it affected smokers around Temple and where they could and couldn't smoke. It was sort of a way of localizing, like hyper-localizing what was a big university issue. So your first challenge when you're thinking about a story to pitch is going to be I call it a news hook. Basically, why are you telling this story now? You want everything to be current, but obviously nothing that you're going to say is super timely, right? You're not reporting on deadline where you're going to report a story in the morning and it airs in the 5 o'clock news. We're not on that tight of a timeline here, but you still need a hook. So let's think back on these stories I just told you about. All of these, when they were happening, you could still make them current, right? The city, you might notice some new signs around town as Richmond is trying to remind drivers to look out for pedestrians, or VCU PD is offering free bike locks to tackle what they say is a rise in bike thefts on campus. Or if you thought your online courses were difficult, think about the sculpture majors, right? You're thinking timeliness, even though these aren't like super timely. You're still thinking of a way to make them current, new, and now. The second challenge is probably the biggest challenge that journalism students have, and that is pitching a story and not a topic. This has to be focused. A lot of times I get people that are pitching things that sound like book reports. Here's an example. So for immigration, right? You can cover something related to immigration, but don't pitch, hey, there's a national conversation about immigration, and I want to focus on immigration in VCU. That is an essay topic. That is not a news story. Here's an example of taking that and making it a little bit smaller, but it's still too broad. Creating a path to citizenship for Dreamers is a big national story. I'd like to cover the plight of Dreamers on VCU's campus. It's too broad. What are you going to do? You can talk to all the Dreamers? Or are you going to follow one Dreamer? Who are you going to follow? How are you going to get a hold of them? There's just so many questions. Here's a good pitch related to immigration. A campus group will offer trainings next week on how to become an ally for undocumented immigrants. I will report on the meeting. That has a hook, right? There's something happening. There's specific people that you can talk to. It involves campus. It's very local. That's the kind of story you want to pitch. You don't want to pitch a topic. Here's another example. I get this one all the time. Richmond has murals. I'm going to see how these come about. That is a topic. A broad idea. Richmond got 4 new murals last year. I'd like to see what they have planned for this year. That's still too broad. You didn't do any research into this before you pitched it. Here's a good pitch. For the first time ever, a local artist has been commissioned for a city mural. He starts painting next week. Obviously a better TV story than a radio story, but it's a great story, and it's very specific, very timely. There's something actually happening. Food festivals. I get pitched a lot of food festivals. I love food. I like to report on Richmond food festivals. That's not a story. There's a Thai food festival happening in Richmond this weekend, and I'd like to go. Also not a story, but I'm sure delicious. Richmond's second annual Thai Festival is happening this weekend after a successful event last year. This year, they expect twice as many people, and handling the crowds amid COVID is a challenge. That's a story. Something specific you can go to. You already kind of have an angle. There's obviously going to be people to talk to. Great pitch. The third thing you need to think about is feasibility. And by this, I mean timing. So your radio package draft, you do a draft of this, I give you feedback, and then you do the finished story about a week later. Your draft is due October 7th. So you need whatever is happening to happen before October 7th so that you can report on it. Or at least pitch something that you could feasibly get done in that amount of time. You do need to talk to 2 sources on tape, so they need to be recorded interviews. So you have to be thinking about, can you get those interviews before that date? You also need to think about access. So for example, you want to do a story on hey, what's going on with the Lee Monument? What are we gonna do with the pedestal? How is it being reimagined? That's great, except for you need to be able to get access to those people. If you haven't even thought about contacting the people who are running that, which I think is the VMFA at this point, then that's not going to be a feasible story for you because you're not going to have the access you need. You can't go talk to Joe Schmo the freshman about his thoughts about the Lee Monument pedestal and the reimagining of Monument Avenue. That's just not a good source for that story. So be thinking about access you need, and don't pitch stories where you're not going to get access. Lots of people want to do sports stories. I don't have a problem with sports stories, but if you can't talk to the players or the coaches, then it's not going to be a feasible story for you. I think you need to go for low-hanging fruit here and set yourself up for success. So you need to have focus, a news hook, feasibility, and sound is another big one. This is a radio story. You want to have natural sound. We never, ever, ever use sound effects in any journalism story. Don't even think about it. So we have to think about stuff with natural sound. The example that I posted on our Canvas page of the Monroe Park reopening has some pretty good natural sound to give you an idea of what you're going for. Another thing that you want in your story is you want to make sure it has some news value and isn't too public relations-y, right? We're not going to do PR for people. So sometimes businesses opening, it can be news, of course, because local businesses opening is news. When Topgolf opened, it was a pretty big deal around here. But we want to make sure it's not too, I'm here to give you free publicity. So that's something you want to keep in the back of your mind when you're thinking about stories. We also talk about wanting to people size our stories. The best stories you're ever going to tell, the ones you want in your portfolio and on your newsreel, are going to be stories centered around people. So if you know somebody living the story, you know someone who got their bike stolen and there's, a big thing about bike thefts on campus and you want to do an enterprise story on it, that's a great story, right? Car break-ins. You know somebody who got their car broken into. That's a good story. I want you to stray away from Interviewing, you can't interview family. I once had someone interview their mom. That if that's just not gonna, don't do that. And you really should try not to interview people you know well. But there's nothing wrong with, hey, I know a guy who knows a guy who does this, or one of your other professors who you don't know very well. All those things are fine. They don't have to be utter strangers to you, but I do want you to actually interview people you don't talk to on a daily basis. So let's go through some pitches, and I'll tell you what I think about them. Police just caught 2 suspects wanted for a double murder in the fan. Yeah, you can't do that story. It's too timely. The police don't want to talk to you. You don't work for a news outlet. I'm not sure why you'd want to cover this story. It's just a little too big and a little too timely. It's a moving target, so we're just going to avoid things like that. It doesn't have good sound, so let's not do crime stories unless they're maybe specifically related to campus. Do a story on the expansion of Circuit Arcade. It's a video game arcade with pour your own taps and Scott's Edition. It's super fun. They are expanding, and it is kind of cool. You'd have to be careful with this one that the timing works out. I don't think they're opening in time for you to do this story. But also not to be too PR, right? We don't want to give them publicity just for the sake of it, but it's a novelty thing, right? So it is kind of cool. I would approve this story if the time worked out. GRTC just installed a bunch of Braille signs so passengers with vision impairments can get around a bit easier. That's a fantastic story, assuming that they did just install them, right? If it turns out they actually installed them 2 years ago and you just found out about it, probably not going to work for the story. But if this was something that GRTC was doing, which they are not, unfortunately, it would be really cool. Former prisoners have started up local basketball league to promote public safety in the streets of Richmond. The fall league begins on October 2nd. That's about the most perfect story you could ever ask for. Great sound, very local, super fun. I want to do a story on a festival at Browns Island on October 3rd. No, I don't know what the story is, right? You're going to have to be a little bit more specific and be thinking about what angle you're going to take and what makes it newsworthy. Plush Nightclub had its liquor license revoked after a shooting outside the club. Another club in Scott's Edition was shut down a few weeks ago after a murder on the property. What's up with the nightclub shootings? Is this a dangerous trend? Probably a little much for you to be taking on in one of your very first 300-level journalism stories. I did have a student try to tackle exactly this story. It did not work out well. He just got nowhere because, shockingly, the nightclub people did not want to talk to him about murder trends, and neither did the police. So, this is a perfectly fine story in a sense. It's just that it might be too big for you to take on. Richmond experienced record rainfall last year. I'd like to do a follow-up story on the amount of rainfall we can expect this year because so far we're behind where we were last year at this time. That's a good story. Enterprising for sure. You'd have to get a meteorologist to talk to you or a meteorology professor at VCU. But yeah, this would be something that's really neat if you have the access to make it work. I'd like to do a story on the Little Free Library. I met a guy who just opened one in Westover Hills. I could focus on him and why he wanted to be part of the program, but also touch on how popular these are in Richmond and where they're at. Great example of a people-sized story. It's not hard-hitting, right? It's not earth-shattering, but it's a good story about a person doing something interesting in their community. So here's where you should be looking for story ideas. I use the plug because we call it being plugged in, right? Do event searches on Facebook. These are actually really useful. Everybody posts everything on Facebook if they want people to come, so that's a good one. There are some RVA-related tags on Twitter that you can look up, but I haven't found them all that helpful. The RVA subreddit and the Virginia Politics subreddit sometimes have some good ideas and interesting things. The Telegram is an obvious one. You can look up flyers on campus. Sometimes I see flyers on those bulletin boards that actually have really interesting events that aren't otherwise advertised. Nextdoor or the community Facebook groups are good sources of information. And of course, ask your family and friends if they know of anything interesting going on that you could do a story about. If you were looking for more official stories, sort of responsive stories, City Council posts all of its committee agendas and minutes on its website. It's pretty clunky, but you can find some really interesting stuff happening. Look at local news outlets. Don't copy their coverage. You're not just going to chase the same story they just chased down, but look back at their old coverage and see what they covered and see if there's something you can follow up on. If there's things you notice around town, like potholes, big one, or the those signs that went up, the pedestrian signs. That's a good place to look for stories. There are, other cities and what their campus news organizations are covering. There might be something similar you could cover on the VCU campus. You can always think about localizing national issues if you're careful about it, and then think about seasonal stories, right? Fall stories, things about weather, things about pumpkins, things about pumpkin spice lattes. Um, all of those make for good story ideas. So that should give you a good start on what to look for your radio story. You can do an enterprise story, you can do a responsive story, you can do something that has to do with campus or something that has to do with the city. Nothing beyond the Richmond area, so we want to keep it local. And you want to keep it feasible. You want to have a news hook. You want to do all the things we've talked about. You have a pitch that's going to be due on Tuesday. So it's actually something you're going to physically fill out. It's up on our Canvas site already. It's called Radio Package Pitch. It's worth 10 points of your draft, of your radio package draft grade, so you definitely want to do it. You're going to turn it in on Canvas. You can go ahead and do it now. You can do it, right before the deadline. I don't care. As long as you get it done by the start of class on Tuesday, you're good. And we will actually meet on Zoom on Tuesday, I promise. Unless there's any other unforeseen, unfortunate events in my path. But let's hope that I'm through that and we can actually meet again. But go ahead and get that done. The other thing you need to be thinking about, of course, is your quiz. Quiz 2 is live, it is due tomorrow by 6 p.m. I'm going to put up a separate video walking you through quiz 1. I would recommend watching that before you take quiz 2 because it should help you do a little bit better. Although a lot of you did really well on quiz 1, but I think some of the questions caught up some of you. So if you want to walk through that with me, it should help you do a little bit better.